behavioral genetics has been confirmed in twin studies and GWAS, and it's pretty robust, and it's explaining huge numbers of the variants, much more than most psychological studies can muster. And yeah, and let's get into the paper here. So the first finding is that all psychological traits show significant and substantial genetic influence. For traits like intelligence, you can see that identical twins have a correlation that's higher than fraternal twins. Diseases like schizophrenia, we can see the same thing where identical twins are much closer and much more likely to develop schizophrenia than fraternal twins. So it seems to be the case that environment being held constant, you're going to have more likelihood of developing similar diseases, similar traits if you're more related to the person with the disease. Even stuff that's much more difficult to measure and it's much more dependent on the environment, like well-being, has made 38% of the variance can be explained by genes, which is pretty surprising. I don't think most people would suspect that, but pretty much for everything we look at, identical twins are much more like their twins than identical twins are more like each other than fraternal twins. And again, just to reiterate, a score of 100% heritability means that no current environmental factors is changing the likelihood of inheriting this trait, this disease, but it doesn't mean that something couldn't, something that we don't know about or something that we know about, which takes me to my next slide. So no traits are 100% heritable. There might be some exceptions with some really rare diseases that, if you get this allele, you're going to have this disease, but certainly traits like anything that's hard to measure, right? Neuroticism, introversion, extroversion, you're not going to have 100% heritability. And this is what kind of Galton figured out. So if you have two parents that are, say, 7 foot tall out here on the right end of the bell curve for height among a population, the likelihood that they have a kid that is taller than them or towards the right side of the bell curve here is vanishingly small, because just by statistical logic, there's more of the bell curve on the left side or shorter than 7 foot tall. So the chance of genes being jingled in a certain way that makes the recombination of them in subsequent offspring taller is just much slimmer. And that's what regression to the mean is. That's what Galton figured out. There is this kind of, which this is true for IQ too, which is kind of much to, I guess, his chagrin, that geniuses are kind of out here on the bell curve. So even if two geniuses have a kid, that the likelihood of them being less bright or less successful than them is almost a guarantee. So heritability is caused by many genes of small effect. So we talked about, so if you have 20,000 participants in a GWA, you can have almost a perfect power to detect an effect size that accounts for 1% of the variance, so 1% of the reason why people vary in a trait or disease. And it's turning out that that's not really, we're not finding associations that are that large, so it's natural to suspect that genes explain much less than 1% of the variance, at least on average. So how do we know that? There's some animal models that let us demonstrate this pretty well. We don't really need them because we're pretty sure of this, but just to kind of hammer the point home. So here on the x-axis, we have generations, and these are mouse lines. And we go up to 30 generations of mouse lines here. And on the y-axis, we have open field activity, or this behavior is like a measurement of anxiety, how likely a rat is to go to the middle of this box, which they usually stick to the walls, generally speaking, and don't go out in the open. They're rather anxious. So these two divergent, these are controls here, these two lines here, and then these two here are the mice selected for this behavior. These are really gregarious mice eventually, and these are really Edgar Allan Poe-ish, shuttered in their room kind of mice. So you can breed them to selectively exhibit more of this behavior if you cross them with the right mice. So if it were the case that a couple genes explain this behavior, this gregariousness, this lack of anxiety, you would see an inheritance event, and then you would see a flat line in behavior. You wouldn't see any difference in behavior, and the line would go off towards the right side of the graph. But what we really see is we see shifts in the behavior in both of these lines up until 28th, 29th, 30th generation, because the shuffling around of these genes as they're being selectively bred for this, there's many genes that can contribute to this phenotype. So we even go down in some cases, we go down, we go up. So there's tons of genes that are getting mixed around that are responsible for this variance. So phenotypic correlations between psychological traits, so significant and substantial genetic mediation. What that means is, so there's genes for reading ability, there's genes for math ability, and up until fairly recently, maybe a couple, 3 decades ago, we thought that, maybe most of these genes are independent. You have genes for reading, genes for math, and they're different. And we're finding that's not really the case. There's generalist genes. So, well, even between phenotypes, say neuroticism and depression, these are 2 different traits. But when we look at the genes, when we correlate the genes for each of these phenotypes, we're seeing that the same genes are responsible for these neuroticism and depression. And there's a way to, this is kind of the way they calculate it. It's a bit too in the weeds, I think, for what we're going to talk about, but just really quick. So this is, A is measures of the genetic role for reading. C is the shared environment, and E is the non-shared environment. So these are all the factors that can affect reading, right? So genes have explain 70% of the variance in reading, and genes explain 61% of the variance in math ability. So when you correlate the 2 genes for both of these abilities, you're finding that there's quite a 0.75 correlation between the 2 genes. So what that means is the genes for both of these are the same genes mostly for both of these abilities, and you can calculate it up here, and you can find that phenotypic correlation, the genetic factors account for 64% of the reason why these 2 phenotypes, reading ability and math ability, go together, are correlated with each other. So genes are explaining pretty large portions of why people who are good at reading are good at math. This is probably going to disturb maybe a couple of you. So the heritability of intelligence increases through development, and this is kind of a one-off. Personality traits are mostly stable throughout as you age. It's not really the whole truth with IQ. So you can have things that affect your IQ one way or the other. Maybe your mother didn't read you Plato. Maybe your mother did read you Plato, and you can shift your IQ up and down with several variables like that. And what we're seeing is that those shifts early in life don't really translate to any long-term effects. We're seeing that you become closer to your parents' IQ as you age, no matter how intensely you read Plato or Aristotle. You tend to drift back towards whatever your parents, however smart your parents were, on the average, of course. So age-to-age stability is mainly due to genetics. Personality traits are not only heritable, they're stable across lifespan, which seems to be, so they have longitudinal studies that show that, environments change, but IQ, mental illness, and personality remain very stable over time. The conclusion that genes are responsible for this stability. But on my last slide, I said that, intelligence increases in heritability as you age. The kind of pet hypothesis of at least Plomin is that, there's small genetic changes early in life that kind of lead to this increased heritability. So genotypic effects lead to, small little changes here and there lead to cumulative effects as you age. So this is a pretty, I'd say, like Plomin's most contentious one, and he's kind of coined this phrase that parents don't matter. Parents matter, but they don't make a difference in their children's outcome. So some of the evidence for this is that genetic effects have historically been confused for the environment. Um, and we'll talk about some of a specific metric on the next slide. But specific parenting and social support, when it's taken as a genetic measure, it yields heritability. So it seems to be that these metrics that we're using that we think are in the environment really are genetically related. Some examples are addiction, divorce. Those show genetic predispositions that before we started looking at the genome, we just took it for granted that this stuff just happens to people and they're passive in this happening to them. You know, people get addicted through no fault of their own. They get divorced through no fault of their own. And it's just happening to them. So another example is that people have noticed that aggressive kids associate with other aggressive kids, but we need to look at it in Plomin's view more in terms of we're associating with the environment that's most pleasing to us or most like us. We're seeing things about the environment that we like and that are like us, other people, that is, and we're associating with them. So we're still on number 7 here. So parents respond to genetic profiles of the kids a lot differently, and it's hypothesized that a lot of the environment, as much as like 25% of it, um, is actually genetic effect. Is it really a genetic? Is it really an environmental effect if you are a parent and your kid is asking you every night to read you Animal Farm? No, they're wanting to. They're putting a pressure on their environment to get what they want out of it, and that shouldn't be seen as something that's passive. It's an active choice of the kid to do that. And we see this in Japan where parenting styles are more, well, what do you want to do kind of styles of letting the child kind of develop into their own personalities. And we compare that to other societies like Sweden that are more parent centered, more amicable for the parents, much more easy for parenting, and making sure that a kid can like live in a society rather than express their unique genotypic abilities. We see that heritability is much more substantial in Japan because they do that rather than in Sweden. So back to what I talked about earlier, you can certainly make traits less heritable by suppressing it or putting pressure on people to behave a certain way. So most associations between the environment and measures of psychological traits are significantly mediated by genes. And so they're kind of Freud's whole shtick was that, anxious mothers made, anxious children. But when you look at it, 2/3 of the correlation between, maternal negativity and adolescent children's antisocial behavior, most of that's genetically influenced. So there's nothing about the environment that's really increasing or decreasing that trait, at least to no substantial effect. But something, when we're looking at measurements of the environment, so the HOME, or home observation for the measurement of an environment, is a huge sociological metric. And you can correlate this metric. How many books does this kid have in his home? How much food does he have? Is he deprived in any learning capacities? So you can correlate that metric with mental development indexes. And what you notice is that when you correlate it for someone who is, so you get a different correlation if you do identical twins or fraternal twins. So you're getting a different correlation when you just vary the genes between these two metrics. So you're looking at measurements of the environment and you're correlating that with how developed the child is. And you see that when the parents are step parents, you're getting less of a correlation because there's less genes involved. And you're only looking at the environment. So when you're just varying the genes, it has to be the case that some of your metrics in this HOME are bootstrapping or taking in some genetic variability. So most environmental effects are not shared by children growing up in the same family. Um, Tolstoy once said that happy families are all alike. Unhappy families are all unhappy in their own way. But environmental factors which make offspring dissimilar is usually unique. So I guess he was right in that way. Trauma, stuff that happens, it's a one-off event, or it's unique to that kid at least. Um, so, so a lot of these things are, it's not what your parents are doing that is common between kids that's making a difference. It's what they're doing that's unique to each kid that is actually having a difference. So the last point here that's really, really interesting, and I think probably the most interesting, um, most psychological disorders, what we call a disorder is just the aggregate of genes for a particular trait. So things like ADHD and autism seem to be spectrum disorders, right? So there's different varying levels of this trait. Um, and it's not a qualitative change. It's not that you get a certain number of genes and you become diseased or you become diseased. It's rather just an aggregate of genes for this trait. So the graph here, so we have neuroticism on the x-axis and risk for depression on the y-axis. And like we talked about a little bit ago, so these are different traits, right? But the same genes are likely influencing this because as we go to the right on neuroticism, we get much higher chance of depression. So it's likely that the same genes are contributing to both of these phenotypes. So just to put some perspectives to this, how big are these variances? How important in the literature is this? Well, sex can explain, depending on what trait you're looking at, about 1% of phenotypic variance for traits. So that's not very big. We were just talking about double-digit variances. Something in a psychological journal, if you explained, if you found one variable that explained 5% of the reason why your kid goes to Harvard, like you would be landed in a cushy tenure position for the rest of your life, eating lobster every weekend with your muckety muck department members. So they're pretty big. That's why people are talking about this. This is very promising. There's some problems with it. One problem that's commonly mentioned is that if you're looking for these correlations, obviously you're not going to have causative genes all the time that you're finding. You're going to have just correlations. And there's a tradition of just throwing in any S&P that's going to explain any amount of the variance whatsoever, and dealing with the causative stuff down the road, not worrying about it. But it's a limitation to the study. But these correlations are, most of them are not going to be by happenstance. There's going to be a reason why people who are having diseases and traits like this are correlated so commonly with these genes. What's next? So once we get to looking at whole genotypes, that would be nice. We're just looking at genes that vary, remember? But for clinical application, it would be great to use whole genomes, obviously. There's proteomics and transcriptomics that can be used too, but that's quite a ways away, even from, most doctors' offices don't even use genomes, so that would be a good first step. And I'll leave you with this quote. Over here we have the big five personalities, all these that kind of explain, why you are the way you are and why you behave the way you do. And just a reminder that everyone falls one standard deviation within the mean. And this is a quote from Moby Dick. Moby Dick was written in the 1800s. And I've been talking about dissimilarity for so long that I think it's just nice to kind of pull back and realize that, as a population, if we're looking at people as a population, we're all virtually the same person, which is rather nice.